You might think that one of the world's largest fast food chains, one that sells thousands of sandwiches a minute, would be doing pretty well. I mean, there are Subways everywhere. In fact, for decades, there were more Subways in the world than there were McDonald's. But recently, the once mighty fast food giant has taken some hits. They've been closing thousands of stores every year, and it's not clear whether they'll ever recover. It's not the pandemic that caused Subway's problems, although that certainly didn't help. This story goes much deeper. It involves a disgraced spokesman, questionable business tactics, and a franchise system that often leaves its thousands of Subway store owners in an extremely vulnerable position. To get to the root of all these problems, we'll have to investigate Subway's earliest days. In particular, its founder, Fred DeLuca. Fred DeLuca was just 17 years old when he borrowed $1,000 from Peter Buck, a family friend, in order to open his first sandwich shop. It was 1965 and Fred thought that a sandwich shop would help him to pay for medical school. With Peter's help, Fred rented an empty storefront in Bridgeport, Connecticut for $165 a month, and he built himself a takeout counter, calling the place Pete's Submarines. But Fred's first stab at slinging sandwiches failed. For one thing, Fred's Brooklyn accent apparently made Pete's Submarines sound like Pizza Marines when he was on radio doing his promotion. So they changed the name to Subway and then tried again and again and again. Despite their initial failures, they kept opening stores, and by 1974, the pair owned 16 locations throughout Connecticut. But they still weren't making a profit, and they still weren't satisfied. You see, they'd set a goal to open 32 Subways by the end of their first decade in business. That's when they turned to the franchise model. With a franchise model, anyone with enough money can open their own Subway, which, as we'll see in a second, has had some disastrous consequences. As a franchisee, you get trained and set up with a location, plus you get to use Subway's brand name. In return, you pay royalties and franchise fees to the company. Under this new model, Subway was able to open 200 locations throughout the US by 1981, and by 1987, that number had grown to 1,000 stores. Throughout the rest of the 1980s and 90s, they averaged more than 1,000 new store openings every year. Now, on the face of it, this seemed really smart, but ultimately it would lead to their demise. All told, by 1998, Subway had 13,200 stores. Not bad for something started by a 17-year-old kid. But how was Subway able to grow so quickly? After all, there are thousands of sandwich shops in the US. What made Subway so special? Well, one element of Subway's success was the layout. The open kitchen design in which customers could see their sandwiches being made right in front of them was comforting, especially to the growing number of people who were getting concerned about exactly what was going into their fast food. And with obesity on the rise throughout the 90s and the 2000s, and public attitudes shifting towards a more informed, health-conscious consumer, Subway decided to go all in on the health angle. That was when they recruited a college kid named Jared Fogle to be part of their new ad campaign. Nowadays, you may know Jared from the Subway ads that were bombarded on our screens for nearly 2 decades. Or you might know him as the guy who got his house raided by the FBI and who, we'll soon see, was discovered to be a criminal of the worst kind, preying on young children. Either way, it's hard not to see Jared as anything other than a monster who none of us suspected. But back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, he was still simply the Subway guy. In college, Jared apparently lost 245 pounds by eating an all Subway diet for a year. To be specific, he'd eat one 6-inch turkey sub for lunch and a 12-inch veggie delight for dinner every day for an entire year. When you say it out loud, it sounds pretty crazy, but according to Jared, it got results. He went from £425 down to £180, and Subway got the perfect spokesman, or so they thought. Now, the marketing campaign that Subway launched around Jared was incredibly successful. In fact, after the first commercial aired, Subway's revenue increased by 20%. By pitching themselves as the healthy alternative to other fast food chains, Subway thrived, and they rode that image right up until the 2008 financial crisis.
Since the crash of
Then, the economy went into recession, and Americans started to care more about the health of their bank accounts than about losing weight. But Subway was there with another ingenious campaign, the $5 footlong. The idea to sell subs for just $5 had actually started with a single franchise owner in Florida in 2004. But in 2008, with customers looking for ways to save money, Subway executives decided to implement the idea across the country. To say it worked would be an understatement. The $5 deal was so popular that other chains, including KFC and Boston Market, simply copied it. According to one restaurant consultant, $5 was, quote, the magic number. Suddenly, anything more than that just seemed too expensive. The $5 campaign was a goldmine for Subway executives and for their many franchisees. But the good days couldn't last forever, and by 2014, Subway's profits began to suffer. Now, on the surface, it's not clear why Subway began its decline in 2014. After all, it was still 1 year before Jared's arrest and conviction, and although their $5 campaign faced competition from other chains, Subway was still the largest in the world by number of locations. But if we take a closer look and follow the clues, it becomes clear that problems had been forming for decades underneath Subway's facade of success. Let me explain. From the very beginning, Fred DeLuca was always obsessed with expansion, and although it took 15 years to start making a profit, Fred and Pete never stopped opening new locations. In fact, after the initial sandwich store in Bridgeport flopped, Fred immediately opened a new one in order to, as he put it, quote, create an image of success. To Fred and Pete, new locations and success went hand in hand. After all, executives earn royalties and franchise fees off of every new store opened. So why wouldn't they open as many as they can? The problem is that Subway's story of success plays out very differently when you look at it from the point of view of the actual store owners. And that is what we need to look at now. Of course, Subway isn't the only chain that uses a franchise model, but one thing that sets it apart is just how easy it is to open your own store. By one estimate, the startup costs for a McDonald's is between $1 million and $2.2 million, while by comparison, to open a Subway store costs between $116,000 and $263,000. That is why Subway owners tend to fit a very different profile than that of other fast food franchisees. While McDonald's locations tend to be owned by investment firms, the more accessible Subways are generally owned by immigrants or young couples. That is, people who are risking their own life savings in order to open a business. The fact that it's so much easier to open a Subway than any other chain means that many of these new business owners don't read, or maybe they can't read, the small print on the contract. This can have huge consequences. For one thing, there's the monthly royalties and franchise fees. Whereas most other chains charge a fee of about 8%, Subway requires their franchisees to pay 12.5% of their profits every month. Then there's the fact that Subway often leases its properties to new owners, which means that they act as the landlord. As the landlord, Subway can simply evict a franchisee when it comes to any legal dispute. And Subway has had a lot of legal disputes over the years. In the 1990s, they had more disputes than any other fast food chain. But that's not the only way Subway owners are at risk. Subway's very own inspection process is notorious for being corrupt. Many owners have had their stores taken away from them for pretty minor things. You see, Subway HQ send business development agents to inspect individual Subway locations. If these agents find that a location has failed to comply with Subway protocols, their store can be taken away from them. But where things get very murky is when we uncover who these business development agents are. You see, agents are store owners themselves, which means it's not unheard of to be inspected by a competitor. And as you can imagine, it's in that competitor's interests for your store to fail, meaning they might then be able to take over your store. According to one former inspector, this is something that happened all the time. She even described herself as a kind of, quote, hitman. In effect, a hired gun for store owners who'd pay her to mark down specific competing stores. But as damaging as these things can be for store owners, perhaps the most damaging thing of all is the simple fact that you can open a Subway anywhere. Technically, you could even have two Subways on the same block. As a franchisee, having another Subway shop in your neighbourhood is one of the last things you'd want, but there's nothing they can do about it. The contracts they sign make it clear that Subway can open a new restaurant even if it, quote, adversely affects the sales of another store. In the words of one former executive, quote, "We put them up any effing place we could." Now, you might wonder why Subway would want to compete with itself. But remember, new locations mean more cash for Subway HQ in the form of royalties and franchise fees. When stores close, it's mainly the individual owners who feel it, not the executives. So, when you see the shaky foundations on which Subway is built, the company's downfall is not so hard to wrap your head around. And Subway's poor sales performance in 2014 was really just the beginning of the end. In 2015, Fred DeLuca, the super intelligent founder, sadly died, leaving Subway in the hands of his sister. That same year, Jared Fogle, aka the Subway guy, was arrested on some horrific charges. He's currently serving a 16-year prison sentence, and while Subway cut ties with him immediately after the news broke, there's no doubt that this was a major PR disaster for the company. What's more, Subway, once thought of as a healthy fast food option, began to see that image unravel. The "Eat Fresh" tagline lost much of its allure as customers and employees alike started to complain about mushy, wilted ingredients. They also called out Subway for its use of preservatives. Among the array of chemical preservatives found in Subway's meats and breads was azodicarbonamide, a chemical also used in yoga mats. And while this chemical is in hundreds of popular bread products, Subway became the main media target. All of these factors set the stage for 2017. That year, Subway closed more than 900 stores in the US. The following year, in 2018, it was 1,108 store closures. And then again, in 2019, they closed over 1,000 stores and saw their sales drop by $210 million. That was before the pandemic. In 2020 alone, they lost another 10% of their stores. Subway's rise may have been meteoric, but it now seems like they're folding just as fast. But are they really about to disappear? Will we soon live in a world without Subways? Well, Subway certainly doesn't think so. Their new Fresher Food initiative involves remodeling thousands of stores to meet the demands of a new generation of customers. These new stores will come with a vibrant colour scheme, self-order kiosks, USB ports, and brand new menu items. Whether or not these changes will be enough to stem the tide is hard to say. The future of the 21st century Subway is still very much up in the air. So, with all of this going on behind the scenes, you might see things slightly differently next time you step into a Subway store. Hey, if you enjoyed this investigation, then check out some of the other videos that are on screen now.